Hello and welcome to PS on Air, where contributors to Project Syndicate engage with the publications that take their work. My name is John Andrews. I'm a contributor to Project Syndicate myself, and my guest today is Bill Emmott, formerly the Editor-in-Chief of The Economist, who has just produced a very good book, very timely, The Fate of the West. And to quiz him, we have David Wighton, who is a columnist for the UK's Financial News, and Christoph Winder, who is weekend editor for the Standard of Austria. In this book, excellent book, I really enjoyed reading it. When you define the West, you're talking about openness and equality. Well, what exactly do you mean by openness, equality, in the context of the West?
What I mean by openness and equality is the running of an economy and a society in a way, first of all, that is open to new ideas, so that there is a free market, that there are liberal educational institutions, that you have freedom of information in the media and freedom of expression in the society. That, therefore, is a society that is open to new scientific discoveries, but especially to meritocracy, to new elites. Equality is important as a political equality, a sense of participation of all citizens in society, equal political rights, what the Greeks called isonomia, the equal voice, whatever you are in society. So this is basically what we mean by a proper democracy, with institutions to protect that sense of equality, particularly the rule of law, to protect equality. The openness is what has varied more over time.
I'm interested in how the impact of the financial crisis has manifested itself in different countries. In Ireland, there was a huge financial crisis, but there has been less of a populist backlash, particularly there's been less of a backlash against the financial sector than in other countries such as Italy, where the backlash has been more, I guess, against the longer-running problems, such as the single currency and the EU in general.
Well, I'd say, in response to that, I'd say yes. The populism is about backlash. It's about failure of success of policies to succeed and to deliver, especially the results that people have come to expect. Sometimes because people suffered, sometimes because their expectations were continuing to rise and were disappointed. But nevertheless, it's a backlash against that. So then the question is, in different countries, how the backlash works out. In Spain, I think, would also be another case where, as in Ireland, there was a huge property crash. There was a strong backlash against the banks, and I would disagree with you. I think there was a strong backlash against the banks in Ireland too. Yes. But there hasn't been the rise of a new movement, a Front National, an Alternative for Ireland kind of party, nor a strong anti-Euro party in Ireland. And in Spain, it's been limited to Podemos, to the left, which was significant but not overwhelming.
Let me bring Christoph in. Populism is a feature, and that's happened, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years in Austria.
Longer than that, we have been in a certain way shameful forerunners of that evolution, because everybody remembers Jörg Haider, whose career started, I'd say, in the mid-'80s, who was a populist avant la lettre, something like that.
Yes.
But still the populist impact in Austria is very, very strong.
Is the feature for Austria, is it reaction to the banking crisis, the global financial crash, or much more immigration?
Immigration, I'd say, immigration. That was the big topic. We got a lot of immigrants in 2015. People didn't know what Ms. Merkel planned, and the Austrian politicians, they made some sort of they copied the politics of Merkel.
And the same thing really has happened in Switzerland. So Switzerland, quintessentially successful, wealthy country, sailed through the financial crisis in many ways, but the Swiss People's Party is a very powerful party because of immigration. now 25% of the people in Switzerland are foreign born. So you can have different triggers for populism. Yeah. Populism is just a method. It's not a. It's not an ideology.
And you argue in the book, Bill, that at a certain point you get a turnaround.
I argue in the book that people can produce a turnaround.
Yeah.
That there can be a turnaround, but I don't argue that it's inevitable. I think that we can sink in a nationalist direction, as we did in previous eras, of course, in the 1920s and 1930s. I think in a more severe environment, in a more severe situation then, but clearly we could go spiraling in a downward direction, and I think a Le Pen presidency in France would risk that, precisely that, spiraling down. That would be very difficult to turn around within 15 to 20 years. So it's all very well. I can say in the long run there'll be a turnaround, but Keynes said in the long run we're all dead.
Yes.
It was in the 1930s, and for the same reason.
Do you think there is a need to have a bit of rebalancing from the openness in terms of immigration to those feelings of belonging and identity that have clearly been expressed in, particularly in the Brexit EU referendum in Britain, but also more widely in Europe and in, arguably, in America?
Well, I mean, I do. I think that immigration policy has always had to be sensitive to the conditions at the time, and I do think that there's always been a case for slowing down the speed of immigration, which means the volume of immigration at certain times. So although, in principle, I would say, bring me your huddled masses yearning to be breathe free, but in practice, you would say, well, bring me your huddled masses, but could you come tomorrow when we're in a stronger position to exploit you, if in a sense, or at least to give you a new opportunity. I don't think that the right answer is to turn off completely. But arguing, as people like me sometimes do, say, look, we need immigration because we're all getting older, it's not a very good argument at a time when you've got 10, 15% unemployment, and you've got people who've lost income steadily over the previous 10 years.
Christoph, what do you have a question for Bill?
Yeah, I would like to ask you if the concept of cultural difference does make sense to you in the framework we are talking right now. How different people react in different situations. And for example, if you compare, we've been talking about France right now, and I mean, the very concepts of what state should do, on how labor market works, is very different from the Anglo-Saxon model. Yeah? So does it make sense to you to talk of cultural differences?
I guess my point of view is that culture may often be the wrong word for it, but certainly the politics, the social reaction to things is very different in different places, and so I think that cultures change, but they often change slowly. So yes, let's say look at Italy. Italy, since the early 1970s, has had, if you like, a culture of total job protection. Before 1970, it had no culture of total job protection. So is this a cultural issue, or is it, as it were, the outcome of a certain political clash that then produced victory that then people don't want to let go of? And so I think often what we call cultural reasons are, if you like, kind of rigidities that are genuinely in people's hearts because they are valued, but they are not forever. So I do think cultures can change.
The Trump victory in America, was it a form of American culture that led to his electoral victory, which after all astounded the pollsters?
I think the pollsters often were right about his strength, but the commentators dismissed it. I think the interpretation of the polls was often wrong in America. Why? Because I think that it was that the kick the bastards out principle was underrated, and the sense that a new kind of messiah figure could come and represent it. Now, after all, and one of the problems was that actually there was a sort of reverse prejudice about it. That 2008, Obama was the one who surprised, and he was the complete outsider, no experience, complete outsider. But he was the first sign of a kind of popular backlash, I would say, against the establishment. So then 8 years later, his as it were opposite in many ways, Trump, basically pulled off the same trick.
I make a point in the book about corporate power.
Yes.
And the misuse of corporate power and the influence it has on politics and society. Yes. How do you see the Trump presidency dealing with this, or does it just get worse?
I think that Trump may reach a point when he thinks that he needs to run against the swamp again, and to as it were revive himself as an outsider. So for the moment, he's basically given up on draining the swamp. So he's appointed a Supreme Court justice who will make it less likely that Citizens United, the campaign finance decision, will be reversed. He's basically appointed billionaires. He's sucking up to business everywhere, every way. But that could change. And I think that he actually is in a position where he could be a Theodore Roosevelt type if he suddenly decides it's in his interest and take on corporate power in the way that Theodore Roosevelt took on Standard Oil.
You argue that in terms of the abuse of corporate power and the capture of the political system by big companies was most extreme in terms of the financial sector, and what happened to regulation in the run-up to the crisis. But you take a very tough and sceptical view of the regulatory response to the crisis, and say that, in fact, there hasn't been a great improvement in the systemic stability of the banking system, despite everything that's happened, which is quite striking, given last week's comments from the Governor of the Bank of England pointing out that the capital requirements for big banks have risen tenfold since the crisis, and regulators believe they are tackling the shadow banking threat that you identified.
The speech by Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the bank that I cite in the book, described this as large parts of the international banking system were what he called uncharted territory, and that means that they're not getting a grip of shadow banking. They might be getting a grip of the idea that they should get a grip, but they just don't know. They don't have the information. Secondly, I think that banks remain far too big to fail, so that while there's been a lot of attempt to try to improve their conduct, I don't think that there's been a lot of attempt to, or a lot of success in actually grappling with the fact that they simply are going to always expect to be rescued at very, very high, at very high cost to the taxpayer, and that shapes then their incentives to misbehave. So, and that is because I think since the crisis, governments have felt trapped between the need to get bank lending going again and the desire to punish the banks. And I would hope, if one had one's kind of ideal, that now that economies are actually getting better, that this might be the time to revisit that and to produce a more long-term.
Do you see that happening, David?
Well, I think the contrary is happening.
Yes,
not just in America, but in Europe.
Yeah, I agree.
Too.
I agree.
So that's a rather unsettling prospect.
Yes, no, I agree. I think it's brewing up the next problems.
What about the political systems in Europe? What about the state of the EU, where you've got different forms of government, and yet everybody seems to be doing pretty poorly at the moment, or perhaps I'm being too pessimistic?
Well, yes, I think that the problem of European performance, as you put it, is one of overly rigid markets and economic systems, combined with fiscal restraints.
You mean it's not Anglo-Saxon enough, as the French might put it?
I would say it's not Scandinavian enough.
Yes, you mentioned Sweden as an example of a country that has turned around.
That has turned around, but in particular, it's got a new balance between open markets.
And Carl Bildt often writes for Project Syndicate. He's very useful. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, I would call it the Spotify economy.
Christoph.
I found it very interesting that you singled out Switzerland and Sweden as who do the Houdini thing.
Yes.
Yeah? Who get out of the circumstances. Why didn't you take Germany in?
Well, first of all, I could have taken others. I think I could have taken Canada. I could have probably taken New Zealand, but it was a bit far to travel to do the research. Now, Germany, I think I could have probably included more on. I think that Germany's situation was, though, quite sui generis in terms of the burden of unification, and I thought actually maybe this isn't quite the right story. But I think Germany does show some parts of this kind of self-transformation capability.
Might it be a question of size as well? Could that be a reason that Switzerland and Sweden do better than...
I certainly think there are some advantages in being small and relatively coherent. I mean, clearly one can't take it too far. Greece is a case of a small is ugly situation, and there are others. But I do think that there are clearly some advantages. It's harder in a large, less homogeneous society and less homogeneous economy. Now you can make some counter arguments, which is that in a place like the United States, you can have more variation in success, and then people moving from one place to another, and that's in some degree the argument for the European Union.
Sure. Well,
the
if
single
you
market.
take the European Union,
yes.
the sort of the wave of populism which seems to have carried on for some time, until you get the Dutch elections, which seem to stop that wave, arguably. And now
I would disagree. I don't think it has stopped the wave. But
how about Macron? Do you think Macron in France, if he gets the presidency, is that also a barrier against this tide of
I think that the
populism
only
or
thing
not?
that will stop the wave completely will be results. Not
A better
electoral
economy.
results, but better economy and more secure societies. So Macron, of course, if he wins on May the 7th, and if he then forms a majority, yes, of course, the populism in France, we won't talk about it for a while.
Yeah.
But if he then repeats François Hollande's success, what's going to happen in 5 years' time?
Well, it has to be said that the latest figures from the Eurozone are much more positive.
Yes,
than
we're in an upturn. Yes,
but let's
exactly.
talk about Brexit for a bit. I mean, I imagine that this is going to dominate not just the British political debate, but the whole EU political debate for the next couple of years. Theresa May talks about Britain being more globally open to the whole world. But I mean, one could argue that actually it's the reverse. She's getting into a sort of an insular frame of mind for Britain.
I think that Brexit is not going to dominate the EU debate. The fact is that we Brits should realize it's not all about us. Basically, it's going to dominate our debate, and that's a tragedy, that we are going to be obsessed by this and dominated by this act of political self-indulgence that Brexit consists of for years to come.
Presumably Marine Le Pen will try to make it the number one with the Frexit.
Well, she'll try to make Frexit the number one subject. As in the Five-Star Movement in Italy, if they were to get to power, they would make potential exit from the euro, Italexit, the main subject.
In the book, I think perhaps the European Union comes off quite lightly in terms of the threats to, or the challenges we've seen to both openness and political equality over the last decade or two. Arguably, the EU has not been a paragon of openness in terms of the rest of the world, trading and so forth. And if you look at the question of whether people feel they have a voice, the number of times that the EU has dismissed quite loud voices from particular countries and just moved the goalpost and walked on.
Well, I think that what we mean by the EU is the way in which national governments make decisions together. So I think that the EU as an entity doesn't exist anymore, essentially, to my view. I think it's basically the conclave of national governments and how they operate. So the problem has often been that national governments have got together and decided either to ignore or to circumvent decisions in one country, most perhaps notably the French and Dutch rejections of the Constitution in 2005. So national governments are the question. The inability to really have a coherent response to the migrant crisis, the Euro crisis, which has essentially been a question of constantly kicking the can down the road and muddling through and not really providing any blueprint, cannot be the sustainable model for the European Union. So whether Macron wins or not, the EU cannot, I think, expect to be continued in its current form in 10 years' time if it continues on this behavior.
I want to quote some wonderful alliteration from one of your final chapters.
I was afraid that you were going to find a mistake. Or
No. Demoralized, decadent, deflating, demographically challenged, divided, disintegrating, dysfunctional, declining. That, you say, is the state of the West. I mean, that's what I'm quoting from your book now. Despite all that, are you still an optimist, or are you really quite a pessimist about the fate of the West?
No, I'm an optimist. I think that...
Despite these adjectives, the D words.
Yes. Yeah, I followed them with the sentence which says that is the view of the...
That is, yes, indeed.
Of the detractors
True.
of the West. So I'm reporting, if you like.
Right, okay.
So, no, I am optimist. I am an optimist. I do think that we are resilient, first of all, and that we have the capacity to find new solutions and new ways through, not to some new golden age or sunlit uplands of perfection, but rather that we can find at least better periods ahead out of this.
But I mean, if you look at the strong men
yes.
At the moment, you could argue that actually they're the ones who are taking the West away from those sunlit uplands.
I don't think that, well, I mean, you mean Putin is interfering with elections?
Well, Erdogan...
well, they're taking their own countries away from liberal democracy, but they're not taking the West away.
Trump?
Trump is if you like...
It is the biggest economy in the world.
Yeah, no. Trump is
maybe not
the test case. Trump
PPP
is the test
basis,
case.
but
yeah. No, Trump is the test case, as Le Pen would be in France.
Theresa May?
Theresa May is a liberal Democrat. I mean, she is an open Britain person, I think. Right. I think she's, no doubt going to do all sorts of things that I would disagree with, but they are within the range of what I would see as being, as it were, liberal, acceptable things to disagree with. Whereas Trump could end up doing some things that would be seriously damaging. I think that the American institutions, combined with his own incompetence, are actually going to prevent him. But that's a rather early judgment to make after 100 days.
So in Trump we trust?
In Trump's incompetence we trust, yes. Now, I doesn't want to be too kind of sanguine and flippant about it. I think that there are still some serious dangers ahead, and I don't think that we should write off Marine Le Pen yet.
No. Well, Bill, it's a terrific book. Thank you very much for being with us in Project Syndicate and PS on Air, and thank you very much for Christoph Winder from The Standard and David Wighton from Financial News. Thank you, all of us, and thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you, John.